Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Raw Men. And I have with me today Eddie Tabash. And Eddie, I know you as a activist through our circles, and I know that you chair the board of the Center for Inquiry. Yes. But more importantly, you're also I think it's a constitutional lawyer.
Yes.
With a primary interest in the Establishment Clause.
Yes.
And I heard you speak the other day here at the American Atheist National Convention, and you opened your presentation with what seemed to me to be a bomb. And you dropped a bomb in the audience with your opening statement. I'd like you to repeat what that was and give me your personal perspective on that.
Well, ever since the 1980 elections, I have been warning that secular people need to treat all presidential elections and all elections for the U.S. Senate as a referendum on the Supreme Court. Because the president appoints and the Senate can accept or reject the nomination. And what I've been saying to my colleagues in non-belief and to liberal religious people of goodwill who want everybody to be equal before the law is that we had always been on the verge of the religious right getting, for the first time in history, a 5-vote majority on the court. With the replacement of Anthony Kennedy by Brett Kavanaugh in October of last year, President Trump has managed to give the religious right, for the first time ever, a 5-vote majority. Ever since 1947, the U.S. Supreme Court has said by at least a 5-vote majority, no branch of government can favor one religion over others, no branch of government can favor belief over non-belief. In 2005, and it was luckily still a dissent, the late Justice Scalia said that the Constitution permits the disregard of the devout atheist and the disregard of believers in multiple deities and in unconcerned deities. So supposedly deists and Buddhists and Hindus, along with us non-believers, could somehow have lesser rights. But what's frightening is those who say, particularly those Supreme Court justices who say government can now favor religion over irreligion, don't say where that stops. How far can it go? For instance, would a new Supreme Court allow somebody who does business with the general public, runs a restaurant, a busy lunch counter, say, my religion tells me that I really shouldn't deal with atheists. I'm not going to seat atheists at my lunch counter.
They've already done that in Texas.
Yeah. What kind of memory does that evoke from America's recent history? So we have this very, very frightening prospect. Last week, Pepperdine Law School, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas said he didn't even know why atheists take oaths, because we have no one to swear to, whereas a Christian has a supreme being. Does that mean that Thomas would vote to allow the states to, after hundreds of years, reimpose the backward, barbaric ban on atheists testifying in court? What does it mean to say government, for the first time ever, will be free to favor belief over non-belief? Now, Justice Kavanaugh, in his writings, in his opinions, when he was a judge on the District of Columbia Court of Appeal, wrote some very frightening opinions. First of all, in a speech a year before he joined the Supreme Court, he actually extolled former Chief Justice William Rehnquist for Rehnquist's retrenchment from church-state separation. He approved of Rehnquist's dissent in the 1985 case of Wallace versus Jaffrey, where he managed to strike down Alabama's moment of silence statute in public schools because it was a Trojan horse for prayer. Rehnquist actually favorably quoted Supreme Court Justice of the early 19th century, Joseph Story, who said America needs to be a Christian nation. So Kavanaugh was defending that dissenting opinion. Also, Kavanaugh once said that if the government cannot make reference to God and religion in formal ceremonies, we are establishing atheism. But that means that if we can't make reference to a godless universe, that we are establishing Christianity. He doesn't take it both ways. It's supposed to go in both directions. There are two areas where the Supreme Court will be able to destroy church-state separation. I call it the pincer movement that we are caught between. One is in saying that government will be able to favor belief over non-belief. The other is something that liberals started, which I warned against as far back as 1990. The Supreme Court and Justice Scalia did get it right in saying that just because complying with a law that binds everybody else violates your religious beliefs doesn't give you the right to be the special lawbreaker. And so it was a liberal civil libertarian outcry, wrongly placed, that enacted the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that said that if complying with the law violates your religious beliefs, government must show a compelling interest to make you comply with that law. In other words, the religious have greater rights. And we saw this in the Hobby Lobby case, where a 5-4 majority of the Supreme Court ruled that every employer of a secular business has to provide coverage for contraception for their employees. But if your business is secular, but you're a personally religious employer, you can opt out of that. And then the Affordable Care Act went so far to try to accommodate the religious. They said, okay, religious people, religious institutions, you don't want to provide contraception coverage, fine. Just let us know and let the insurance company know that you won't do it so we can provide it on our own. A group called Priests for Life didn't even want to give notice that they won't be complying with the contraceptive mandate because they felt by giving notice they're in the line of fire whereby they will notify the right people who will still get their employees contraception. Kavanaugh approved of this. Kavanaugh approved of this. And what Kavanaugh said is that all anyone has to say is complying with this law, even though it binds everybody else, violates my religious conscience, and you don't have to comply. So this is the crosshairs we are caught in. On the one hand, the Supreme Court saying government can openly favor belief over non-belief. On the other hand, the Supreme Court now saying that only the religious can avoid complying with laws that bind everybody else, including anti-discrimination laws. So if you look at, for instance, the kind of laws that Vice President Pence was pushing when he was governor of Indiana, he wanted people to be able to refuse to do business with gay people if it is a consequence of their religious belief. So if you are claiming a general prejudice against members of the LGBTQ community, you can't refuse to do business with them. But if you claim a religious objection, you can. Once again, the Pence view, the Trump view, the religious right on the Supreme Court view is that only the religious get to dodge complying with laws that bind the rest of us.
Well, that seems to have been the case all along. I mean, religion has always had special privilege.
Yes, but this is cementing it.
No, I'm not
Yeah, right.
arguing that.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to make any excuses to minimize the severity of the situation. I always thought when I was a kid that when you claim a particular religion, you get the privileges that come with that religion. It should be that you're free to believe and worship as you will. But that still means that when you go get your driver's license picture, that you have to take off the burden.
Sure, of course.
And
because
they
they
shouldn't have
have
allowed the colander.
Right. Right. So one of the biggest problems is that even with the rise of non-believers and the non-religiously affiliated, we have made progress only because we've had equal rights under the law. When we lose equal rights under the law, we are going to start to decline. Non-believers will not be able to expand our numbers if the Supreme Court opens the floodgates for every branch of government to enact religion-promoting legislation. So all the progress we've made the past few years the rise of the nuns, the rise of the non-affiliated, more people admitting they don't believe in a deity, whatever that is, will be stymied if government can now unleash formal prejudice in favor of theistic belief. It's also very important for those of us who are atheists to run on what I call the twin tracks. On the one, promoting atheism as a worldview, not by coercion, but by argument and reason. And number two, working with everybody, including religious people of goodwill, in order to secure the equal rights for everybody. So this is why I, though involved in many atheist organizations, have been on the board of trustees for over 20 years of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, which is an organization that in its current form fully supports the equality of everybody. And so of course, chair of the board of Center for Inquiry, my uppermost concern is expanding public awareness of atheism, scientific skepticism. But in terms of the legal political landscape, we have to work with everybody to make sure we have equal rights. And this is something we need to learn from the LGBTQ community, which is they first were not able to elect their own to office. They elected sympathetic people who weren't from the community but supported their equal rights. We have to start doing that, and of course, it is decades overdue for known non-believers to be able to get elected to public office. And this is something which really has to start happening. But in the meantime, there's a new strategy. I'll give you a very sad example. Because of the remaking of the courts, not just the Supreme Court, but the lower federal courts, we took a horrible defeat in the District of Columbia Court of Appeal just 2 days ago, where the court ruled against wonderful, wonderful atheist pillar, Dan Barker, Freedom from Religion Foundation, who sued the chaplain of the United States Congress because the chaplain wouldn't let Dan give a non-religious invocation. The Court of Appeal upheld the right of the chaplain of the House of Representatives to deny Dan Barker the right to give a secular invocation.
And the chaplain is representing the state.
Is representing the United States Congress. Is representing the House of Representatives.
So what you're saying is that Obama may be our only president to acknowledge that atheists are part of the citizenry.
Thus far, Bill Clinton did too. Nobody remembers in one of his 1996 debates against Bob Dole, he mentioned the First Amendment protects even non-believers. So we have a very grave crisis if in fact a newly reconstituted Supreme Court goes back centuries and allows the rearing of the ugly head of formal discrimination against atheists. Now, one of the reasons why Dan's loss in the District of Columbia Court of Appeal is so ominous is, for the first time ever, we as a movement don't have a net under the tightrope. We are actually afraid of asking the Supreme Court to take the case because we are afraid that with the new 5-vote majority, they would uphold what the congressional chaplain did. So this is the new nightmarish era for church-state separationists, where we might have to do something we've never done before and for decades, and that is to strategically try to avoid the Supreme Court. The one tribunal in the United States that could always be counted upon to protect our equal rights, regardless of what happened at the state or the federal level. The court that had Justice David Souter that had William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall and Harry Blackman and John Paul Stevens and Sandra Day O'Connor and to a large extent Anthony Kennedy. That court is gone. Now, people have tried to search for some optimism, and I'm all for it if, as we know, it's based on facts. People have been asking me throughout this American Atheist Convention, particularly lawyers, well, Chief Justice John Roberts will come our way and save us. No, he won't. If you read his dissent in the same-sex marriage case, it's horrible. So what has to happen is next year's presidential election has to be looked at as a referendum on the court. We've already lost the court by a 5-vote majority. We don't want to have a 6-vote or a 7-vote religious right majority. So next year, secular-minded people must view all U.S. Senate elections and presidential elections as revolving around the federal courts and around the Supreme Court. Now, if in fact, which could happen, the president consolidates the religious right majority in the court by replacing Justice Ginsburg, let alone the situation we're in now, we're looking to decades and decades of a religious right-wing Supreme Court. This means secular-minded people have to populate the state legislatures. We have to get into Congress. And it also means that it's not just people who are left-wing on every issue. We also need principled conservatives who can win in only conservative areas, but who oppose the religious right. We have an example. The father of modern conservatism in the 20th century, Barry Goldwater, Senator of Arizona, Republican nominee for president in 1964, finished his career opposing the religious right because he was a true believer in limited government. So we need politicians from all over the spectrum. My dream would be, in 20 years, when someone stands up, member of Congress, member of state legislature, and says, I believe religion and government should be separate, that from that alone we would not be able to tell where they stood on any other issue, to make it universal. But to do that is going to be a massive effort. The strategies will have to be taking over legislative bodies, because we can't rely on the courts.
I have to tell you that the reason that I became an activist myself was some 20 years ago. I'm talking to a religious person representing his congregation. He's bragging to me about how his church voted as a bloc in a coalition of churches, all voting the way their ministers told them to, as part of this plan to overthrow all of the local, and like the school boards, the senators, the judges. They were bragging about how they positioned all these people for the ultimate goal of taking over the government with conservative-minded, religiously believing people. And it sounded ridiculous to me, but that was like a month before the Wedge document came out, which is detailing the same plan.
Yeah.
And the only difference between them was that the guy I was talking to was looking for people from the Chalcedon Institute to lead this country, and he was expecting a government that would enforce Levitical law.
The Dominionists.
Yes.
The Reconstructionists.
Exactly. And so that's what charged me up, that even though I was effectively powerless, I had to do something, so I had to become more and more involved. The situation that we are in now, now that we are, like a third of Americans, people under 30, are essentially atheists, whether they know what atheist means or not. They're unbelievers, right? They don't have a religion, they don't think religion is important. So they are effectively us. And a quarter of the people in our age bracket are also atheists, which is profound. We outnumber Catholics, and we just now outnumbered Protestants. But the places of power, every level of my state and federal government, in Texas especially, gone up to the federal, is now owned and controlled by Christian Dominionists. And the parallel that this draws for me is it's like being in Ireland, where Ireland owned all the schools are Catholic, and the government is completely Catholic, their constitution is very religious, and yet you're hard-pressed to find religious people in the big cities in Ireland. And you see Ireland becoming more and more progressive than we are now. So I'm wondering, what is the grassroots base going to be able to wag the dog in this case and take control back?
In many countries it can. I'm not so optimistic about here, because here, when government controls policy, you can see that what the government does, what the courts do, the courts are usually slightly ahead. And if the court says atheists have to be equal, abortion has to be legal, people of the same gender should be able to get married, you have no choice but to follow. But what now when the court goes in the opposite direction? We are not able then to stop the religion-promoting legislation coming out of the legislatures. State legislatures, as you know from your home state of Texas, have the most extreme religious right-wing members.
Yeah.
Once the Supreme Court signals that a new majority will uphold religion-promoting legislation, we're never going to see the end of the type of religious-promoting laws that are going to start coming out of the woodwork.
And then my fear is that where once in the early 70s, if you looked at Afghanistan, if you looked at Iran, if you looked at Egypt, you would never have expected that someplace could be that progressive as each of those places were then, to see what they are now.
Yes.
And it's frightful because they were where we are. And so it's frightful that we could be the next Iran or Afghanistan.
Well, here is the problem, and that is, to what extent will the Supreme Court allow the religious to have rights that non-believers don't have? Where will it end? Will there be a stopping point? In 1998, my alma mater, Loyola Law School of Los Angeles, invited me to come back to the school for a day with Justice Scalia. And I approached him and we began talking. And he loved to banter. And I said, Your Honor, I'm a practicing attorney. I've done church-state amicus briefs in the court. I don't want to transgress any ethical boundaries. And he said, no, we're standing here. Come at me and let's get into it. And so I asked him all sorts of questions. I said, Your Honor, where would it be that the line would be drawn, that the religious have greater rights? And he said, I'm not sure what the end result is, but government can favor belief over non-belief. I said, but government can't deny me certain freedoms. And he said, probably not. And then I said, Your Honor, I'm going to be a little bold here. I know that you don't think that the Establishment Clause protects atheists like me. However, you would rule, knowing you and being a student of all your opinions, I said, Your Honor, you would rule that the Free Speech Clause of the First Amendment protects us. And he said, that's not bad. You know, I mean, and it was funny because, he was very jovial, very aggressive. And as we were parting, and he shook my hand, slapped me on the back, and said, even though you're an atheist, you can now tell your fellow atheist that you had a conversation with the devil. But let's look at, for instance, worst case scenario. Worst case scenario, there are laws allowing only the religious to do all sorts of things. So we try the free speech clause, saying, wait a minute, government may be able to favor the religious, but it can't, under the free speech clause, disfavor us because of the content of our speech. So when we say God does not exist or religion is false, under the free speech clause we have to be equal. Some other religious right-wing law professors have said that that could be pardon the pun, the saving grace. But I don't want to get there. You see, this is the...
I'm worried about how long it takes before they establish blasphemy laws.
Yeah. Now, as far as blasphemy laws are concerned, I believe the free speech clause protects us. I certainly know that Scalia would have struck down a blasphemy law. A blasphemy law, that's one thing I would trust Chief Justice Roberts to strike down. Thomas, Gorsuch, Alito, Kavanaugh, I would hope that they would. The problem is, if you're an extreme religious right-wing legal thinker, you look to the era of the Constitution's enactments. No way to do it, because the Constitution was enacted to remedy these problems. But what some legal scholars on the very far right are saying is, wait a minute, blasphemy laws existed in the states at the time the First Amendment was enacted. And we're saying, yes, but it was enacted so that the federal government couldn't do that. And then when the 14th Amendment was enacted, which incorporated the Bill of Rights of the states, that's when the states were bound by the same thing. Like, for instance, the First Amendment was enacted, and then we had the sedition laws, where it was actually a crime to insult the President of the United States. Well, you can't have that consistent with the First Amendment. So you can't say that we are confined to the wording, that the wording is confined to the practices at the time of enactment. But I would think that a blasphemy law would not now be upheld. However, if in fact government could deem religion to be of utmost importance, I don't know 20, 30 years down the line with the religious right-wing Supreme Court, what would happen. I remember being shocked out of my mind in 1989 when the Ayatollah issued the fatwa on Salman Rushdie for the book The Satanic Verses. And of all the things in the world, the right-wing Catholic politician Pat Buchanan supported the Ayatollah, saying that there's too much disrespect for religion.
So you would think that the world trend, atheism is on the rise, we're on the rise in all 50 states, we're on the rise around the world, religion is in general state of decline, yet the power is not.
Well, religion in general decline around the world. I don't see fundamentalist Islam on the decline yet around the world.
But no, fundamentalism is an interesting thing. The statistics that I'm seeing, especially in this country, is that we have creationism on the rise at the same time that atheism is on the rise, and the only way that can be is that we're losing our middle-of-the-road moderates, and everybody's becoming polarized. And that's a dangerous situation.
So, but also worldwide, I don't yet see a decline in Islamic fundamentalism. And I haven't yet, because I've been busy at the convention here all day, I don't know if there was any further discovery of who bombed all the Christian churches in Sri Lanka this morning.
I wasn't aware of that.
About 200 people were killed.
Yeah.
So, you see, I don't know. And then also the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand. But I'm not sure to the extent worldwide. For instance, Brunei has just enacted the harshest Islamic penalties, death penalty for being gay. And Saudi Arabia just chopped off a mentally disabled man's arm because he was masturbating in a mosque during Quran recitation. It chopped his hand off. I mean, so I don't know worldwide what's happening with fundamentalist Islam, and I don't know in the United States whether fundamentalist religion is not going to be completely reinvigorated by the new Supreme Court.
A few months ago, I was giving testimony to the Board of Education, as we so often do in Texas, and I remember they were talking about history this time as opposed to science, and there were a number of experts that were brought in from various universities, and they were all secular, but they all seemingly were religious at the same time. I mean, I don't think any of them came out as atheists. They didn't announce that. One of them was Jewish, culturally Jewish, maybe atheist. One of them was a minister, so we know at least one of them was definitely a believer. And there was another one that was speaking that I kind of got the impression she was too. But they all had degrees in history, and all of them had the same statement, that the United States government that was established as a secular nation was the envy of other nations because we had done something nobody else had done. And they were talking about how great it was in the eyes of the rest of the world, that we had the one country that you could flee your persecution. Always religion always fights against itself. So if you could flee from another religion to here, then it wouldn't matter what you believed. It wouldn't matter if you didn't believe. You had an equal shot. That's what made America great, if I could take that statement. And we were all of these people, myself included, were praising this facet of our country to the Board of Education, who would not hear it. They were determined that they're going to teach what every scholar in the room said is not a fact. This is not true. You cannot teach this. This is a lie. The Board of Education insisted on teaching it anyway. So we're just telling people that it is and always has been a Christian nation, so they'll never notice when it isn't anymore, or when it becomes one, I should say.
Well, on a practical level, secular people, church-state separationists, have to start running for local office. Now, what you just mentioned is crucial. The religious right began to consolidate its power in the early to mid-'80s by running for school boards. We need church-state separationists to run for school boards in places like Texas, in rural parts of the country.
So every level of government, even the city council and so
yes,
forth.
But boards of education are extremely important because that's where the religious right began to do its mischief on creationism and sex education, is on boards of education. And book banning. People forget that, but there was a lot of book banning going on of novels in the early 80s, efforts to remove books that the religious felt were offensive from school libraries. And there was no concept, they had no concept that a book cannot be banned just because somebody finds it offensive.
We also have racist and political ideologies that are being subtly worked into our history and social studies books that are obviously supposed to make the children or the students inclined to vote more red, to be more conservative, to idealize conservative values. And that's all very obvious when you read any of the contested materials.
Well, for instance, I think it was the Texas textbooks that wanted to exclude mention of Thomas Jefferson.
And replace him with Jefferson Davis.
Yeah. Okay, well, here again, this is contrary to fact. Third President of the United States, the greatest influence on James Madison in drafting the religion clauses. This is undeniable. The other thing, too, is in order to have a fact science-based society, we're going to have to elect the right people to legislative bodies. It means school boards, it means town councils. And one of the things I've been saying since my 2 runner-up finishes for the California legislature in 1994 and in 2000 is that particularly within the atheist community, and we can be an opinionated group of people, and we have opinions on every topic under the sun, we cannot, if a brother or sister atheist runs for office, hold them to agree with us on every single conceivable issue, because otherwise we can never support a colleague for atheism. In atheism,
So you talk about purism. I know exactly what you mean. There are a number of people in the atheist movement. I say all the time. Very often when I'm on stage with a controversial person, or people that I've heard, I couldn't do anything with that guy because this one thing. We agree with everything except this one thing.
Yeah.
And I have to make announcements to make sure everybody understands that I don't agree with anyone about everything. But there are people in this movement that I may only agree with on one or two things, but they may be a powerful ally on those two things that we agree with, and I will work with that guy. And we can argue about the other stuff later.
Yeah.
So that's the way. One of the things that I keep trying to reinforce for people is that we are outnumbered, we're outgunned, we're outfinanced, we're being overpowered. And I feel like we sometimes when we're doing the infighting, if you will, we are two sheep smacking our helms when we have an army of wolves surrounding us.
But the point is, if let's say, for instance, as could happen, an atheist is running for office, and that atheist may not adhere to the left-wing line on every conceivable issue. I know a lot of my brother and sister atheists who wouldn't vote for them, notwithstanding that they would promote our core issues because of disagreement on some of those unrelated issues. If we hold to that level of demand, that we're only going to support a brother or sister atheist if they are in accord with us in every single issue, we won't be able to elect any of our own to office.
Well, in fairness, I don't want to say that I'm going to vote for somebody just because they're an atheist, because I've seen
Right.
SE Cup, I've seen
Yes.
atheists that I wouldn't want to be associated with. It was always going to be on policy, but I will do as you say. I will look at my primary policies and what can we work around about the areas that aren't a perfect match.
Right, exactly. What can we do in the areas that aren't a perfect match? And also, because we atheists are a reasonable, fact-based, intellectually based group of people, what if, for instance, we have definite policy disagreements on a few key issues with another atheist, but that atheist needs our help for office, and even if we disagree with them on that issue, they're able to give a reasonable, well-thought-out justification for their position?
Well, I'm open to changing my mind if you can.
Well, no, it's not changing our minds about the issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's saying, I haven't changed my mind to agree with this candidate on this issue, but they've shown me sufficient reason for their holding their position, I'm going to give them a pass.
Let's say that that's based on the circumstances.
Right, it is based
I'll
on
reserve judgment.
Yeah,
till
reserve
after.
judgment. But I'm just saying, I've seen it, and knowing the practical obstacles for atheists to support other atheists for office, this is one we'll have to grapple with.
I can see a couple of circumstances where Bernie, for example, I agree with him on this or this or that, and then he says this other thing, and I wish I had 5 minutes to explain how that other thing is, so that maybe he wouldn't say things like that again. But I mean, every candidate is going to be like that.
Right. Every candidate is going to be like that. So, had we not lost the court last October, it would be crucial, but not that crucial.
I met you years ago, many years ago in Orange County, California, and you were warning me then that this day was coming and what we had to do. And that's why it's eerie that we're sitting here having this conversation 6 years later and it happened.
Yeah, it was in 2012. What was happening then is, of course, because we're all 501c3 organizations, we couldn't support or endorse candidates, but I was trying to let people know that during the 2012 election, in the general election, there was one candidate who had already put church-state separationists on the court, and the man running against him would not put church-state separationists on the court. And I had a terrible time with people who would say to me, oh, but Obama didn't close Gitmo, or he didn't get the public option in the healthcare. And my response was, do you want Romney putting people on, I mean, it's in retrospect now, I can talk about it. Do you want Romney putting people on the Supreme Court? Robert Bork, the greatest totalitarian ever nominated to the court by Reagan, the worst thing Reagan ever did. Robert Bork, a judge who didn't even believe that free speech protected anything outside of a political campaign. Robert Bork was Romney's legal advisor. And so I was telling people, if Romney beats Obama, we will lose the Supreme Court. and they were saying, you're right, but because Obama is not progressive enough on this issue or that issue, I can't. That's what I mean.
Even if that were a valid argument, I get your point there. Romney's going to be progressive.
Yeah.
What can you say?
Well, see, what they do is they say, okay, we'll sit out the election or vote for a third party.
Oh.
We have to recognize that the far left put the far right in office in 2000. Mathematically, there's no way Gore would have lost Florida if Nader wasn't on the ballot, and he would have been president. So the far left put the far right in power. Had Nader not run as a third-party candidate, Gore would have clearly won an electoral college majority and been president of the United States instead of George W. Bush. So the issue is whether individual-minded people, like many atheists and free thinkers are, can come together in sufficient political discipline to accept a broader tent of peoples and ideologies, which broad tent is necessary in order to elect people who will protect us from a religious tyranny. Because right now, the door to the mothership that has always protected us, the Supreme Court, is closed. We actually now, as I said earlier about even Dan Barker's case, we actually have to think, and it's nauseating. Wait a minute. For the first time ever, we're not going to petition the Supreme Court to take the case. Because it'll be worse.
We literally can't trust justice.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. I mean, if you read the speech, Justice Kavanaugh, 2017, praising Rehnquist for eroding the wall of separation of church and state. If you read what he said in terms of how we'd be establishing atheism unless we had government references to religion, if you read what he wrote about why the religious should be the only ones that could, just by stating a religious objection, avoid complying with laws that bind the rest of us. Now, something very funny. This is really funny. It's ironic. Kavanaugh had the support, though he's a very right-wing Catholic, of many Protestant, fundamentalist Protestants, evangelicals. Well, there was a case where the Navy was giving preferable retirement benefits to Catholic clergy over Protestant clergy. And even over a very well-worded dissent, Kavanaugh ruled that the Protestant clergy didn't have proper standing to challenge this. At the end of the day, Kavanaugh let stand the Navy's treating Catholic clergy better than Protestant clergy in terms of retirement benefits, so it's sort of unconstitutional. So I would tell evangelical Protestants, you don't know who this guy is. You know, I mean, this is, and with Kavanaugh showing that he would even pull strings so that his fellow Catholics could be treated better by a branch of government than Protestants. Not only does he violate the religion clauses of the Constitution by saying government can favor belief over non-belief, he violates the religion clauses by allowing government to show preference for one religion over others. The last thing that I would say is to re-emphasize how important it is for atheists and secular-minded people to seriously consider populating state legislatures, local town councils, school boards, and if possible even Congress, with people who want religion and government separate, regardless of where those prospective elected officials stand on other issues. Because unless church-state separationists, be they religious, be they atheist, be they Democrat, be they Republican, be they libertarians, unless church-state separationists start to occupy rule and law-making bodies of government, we will not be able to stop the juggernaut of religion-promoting legislation which the newly Trump-revised Supreme Court will now uphold. I mean, whether or not America can go forward as a modern secular democracy or becomes a theocracy depends on our being able to stop religion-promoting legislation from emerging from state legislatures and also from Congress, which laws would now be upheld by the new Supreme Court. And then, of course, always view every election for the United States Senate and every presidential election with the Supreme Court as the most important issue.
Thank you, Eddie.